Came up with one. I would throw rocks the size of lemons or baseballs. I'd wait to throw them until I could see the whites of the stallion's eyes. I carried a lightweight .357 Magnum revolver in case I needed to humanely put down one of my horses due to some catastrophic injury, and I took the pistol from my saddlebag and slid it into my vest pocket. I didn't know what I would do with the gun, maybe shoot the ground in front of the roan stallion, but if I did that, Badger, sensitive as he was, would probably jerk the reins from my hands and take off across the desert, which would leave me down a horse and in a world of trouble, assuming I could hang on to chicken fry. I readied my horses and hardened up the cinches on both saddles tighter than if there had been no Mustangs in my future. I stepped onto Badger and eased downhill into the furnace of an August afternoon. When I was halfway to the corral, the roan horse saw us. He jerked his head up from grazing, and I cursed him. He took a few halting steps, broke into a trot, and pretty soon was headed our way at a run. I slid from the saddle and informed Chicken Fry and Badger that we were about to have our first scrape with the Mustang. The roan stallion made quick work of the distance between us, and when he was 100 yards off, he vectored to the right, hammering over the dry plain on black hooves that looked and sounded as hard as the basalt cobbles beneath him. He arched his neck and swung his head in bold communication, and his posturing was not lost on me. He was a large horse, the color of rust, with a black mane and tail, and his head was dark and unrefined. Old scars on his flanks and along his back showed as gnarled lines and crescent moons, haired over glyphs from that hierarchical herd sorting that betrayed him to be no colt, but a mature horse. The tops of his legs had the horizontal striping of ancient equine DNA, and though I knew he carried the distant pedigree of a domestic horse, he looked as raw and wild as the desert that made him. He wheeled a full circle around us at a gallop. In one hand, I held the reins to Badger and the lead rope to Chicken Fry and had a rock in the other as he came in front of us, some 40 feet off. I missed with my first rock. The second hit him at the base of his neck, and he shied violently, leaping forward into the air and pawing at the rock that had just invaded his space. I landed another rock in his flank, and he bucked, kicked his hindquarters straight out with a snap of hooves and muscle that looked like he might kick the door off heaven, and then he took off at a flat run in the other direction. He charged another circle around us, but this time he appeared frustrated. He stopped square in front of us, looking right at me with his head held high and his nostrils flaring, and I figured this was my chance to put one between his eyes, but I missed. The rock flew wide to his left, and he dodged right and disengaged, quartering away from us at a walk. Chicken Fry and Badger were unfazed, had stood quietly behind me while I stood our ground. I filled my pockets with more rocks. Once the roan was about 100 yards away, he lowered his head to graze, but he was not disinterested. I could see the insides of his ears. His ears turned toward us told me that we held his focus as I made for the corral afoot, leading Chicken Fry and Badger so that if the stallion made another run for us, I'd be ready. I'd known that there would be wild horses in Utah. I'd known that wild horses would be a fixture of the range between the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada, but I hadn't anticipated the acute threat they would pose to my horses. I might as well have been camped on the African savanna with lions and leopards. The Mustangs felt just as dangerous. For the past 3 months, I'd seen the color of the West in shades of people and land and circumstance. I was passing through a continental theater where I found too little rainfall, too much of the original prairie broken up by the iron plow, too many old-timers who remember heavy snow winters like they just don't get anymore. I found too many invasive species, too much irrigation draining dwindling aquifers, too many small towns ready to fall off the map. But what I found at the mud hole 3 days into the desert was different, more unsettling. The roan stallion reminded me that the undiminished wildness of the West was dangerous, beautiful and intriguing, but dangerous, and that not everything had changed since the days of the Pony Express.
So we were chatting a little bit before we got started about some of the commonalities of these two books. Obviously, the geography overlaps to some degree. And place is obviously essential for both of these books. And I guess my first opening question for you all is, what do we learn about our past when we sort of remove ourselves from the archives, we get out of the libraries, we log off of Google, we actually go and immerse ourselves in a place? Like, what does that teach us that books can't?
For me, it was really the environmental circumstance that you are never free from the governing hand of the land. That, you know, a lot of these places, and this is true for First Migrants too, that a lot of this country is just as hard now as it was then. And modern conveniences have certainly like dulled that edge, but the sense of place remains, I think, very prevalent in the psyche.
Yeah, especially on the Great Plains. And I mean, I'm not from the Plains originally. I did my PhD at the University of Nebraska, but I grew up southwest of Chicago. And there is sort of a shock when you get on the plains and see these big skies, no vertical relief. And that experience is there today, just as it was for these folks coming from the verdant hills of Kentucky and arriving in a treeless landscape, wondering how they're going to build homes. So yeah, the place sort of creates the context for these Black homesteaders who were essentially lied. I mean, the folks I was talking about at the beginning of this book, when they were told they're going to Nebraska or Kansas, they're told that there'll be plenty of timber, there'll be wild horses that are easy to tame to do your labor, like
so
just like
easy.
that.
Just
yeah.
go put a halter on them. Yeah.
And when they arrive, and they're also told that like Nicodemus already exists, and there's mercantile industry, and there aren't even buildings. Some people turn and leave, and the second group that arrives, Williana Hickman, being shocked by this terrain that's so different from Kentucky. She's in a wagon and hears her husband and folks whooping and hollering, and she says, "Oh, what's this all about?" And they're like, "Well, there's Nicodemus." And she remembered saying, I'll never forget this quote. She said, "I looked with all the eyes I had and said, 'Where is Nicodemus?' And they pointed to some smoke rising from a house dug out into a hill." And she said she just began to weep. So place is important, but like what I love about Will's book too is you bake in the history of the place and how it's changed over time within your narrative. Because when these folks are arriving in the Great Plains, unlike now, like the grizzly bear range used to stretch into the Great Plains. There were wolves on the plains before the U.S. government hunted them down, and they tried to hunt the coyotes but failed because coyotes spent their lives hiding from the wolves. But I think you did a great job in your book of doing that. But yeah, the place is so important to the narrative. Yeah.
What does Nicodemus look like right now?
It is a National Historic Site. And if you buy my book, proceeds go to help support it too. So you don't have to think I'm just helping this.
But there's not much there, right? There's a marker.
Oh no, there are buildings. There's
a
schoolhouse. They have Park Service workers on staff. Yeah. And it's the only one remaining. Deerfield, Colorado. There are still buildings there, and they're starting to sort of gather a group together to help preserve those buildings and maybe get some sort of recognition. There is a marker at DeWitty. And I've talked, I worked with descendants while writing the book. I talked to some DeWitty descendants, and they get sort of frustrated when, like, the marker says DeWitty failed in the 1930s. And like, it didn't fail. It wasn't meant to last forever. It was meant to educate the next generation. So a lot of these places, just like a lot of white farmers, like they died out during the Great Depression. It doesn't mean it was a failure necessarily.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I promise I'll turn it over to you. I think we'll have lots of time for questions from you all. But what was the biggest surprise? I mean, I'm sure you had preconceived notions when you went into these projects. What surprised you most sort of on the other end?
Well, so this project started after my the first book I did with two co-authors called Homesteading the Plains Towards New History. Have some copies out there as well. And so we wrote that book, and the Homestead National Park approached me and my research team. They're like, "Well, this is a great book. we realized the story we tell at the Homestead National Park is a really white story, and we know they're Black homesteaders. And so my co-author and I, we said, oh, this will be an interesting article that we can write. And then we were just surprised by how much we found once we started looking. And it's not exactly easy to look for race in the homestead records because there is no like check the box for race category on them. So there's a lot of combing through Black heads of household in the census and comparing them to homestead records. But that was the surprise for us. There was so much out there.
I think the biggest surprise for me was the difficulty in staging the Pony Express. So the Pony Express was a fast horse mail relay. So riders would ride a horse 15, 20, 25 miles and get on a fresh horse at a way station. And there were 190 of these stations between St. Joseph, Missouri and Sacramento. At Sacramento, the mail was put on a boat, went down the American River to San Francisco. And so 190 of these stations spaced throughout this very sparsely populated country was always like seemed to me to be a pretty phenomenal act. But then as I walked it, so I was traveling at 3 miles an hour, the speed of a walking horse. You could have set your watch by it, and I was just astounded that they could have pulled it off in the first place. It was unbearably expensive to operate. And after seeing all this, it's very clear why. They had to there were 15 stations on the Pony Express route that had no water. So they had to haul water to these stations with barrels in the back of a wagon or with a big water tank. And if you have 6 horses at a station, they're going through 1,000 gallons of water a week. And water, as anybody who's ever hauled water, it's heavy. It's difficult to handle. It's heavy. It's, cumbersome in every way. And the fact that they made it last for 18 months, everybody's like, wow, that's so short, such a brief flash in the pan, and yet we remember it. But the fact that they even made it 18 months to me is remarkable achievement by the architects of the Pony Express and by its enactors, the riders and the people who actually hauled the water, looked after the horses, and made it happen.
You say, and yet we remember it. Why do we remember the Pony Express so well? What is it about the Pony Express that sort of...
I've been, even when I was pitching this book to publishers, they're like, why do we remember the Pony Express? And one short answer is that Buffalo Bill Cody, William Frederick Cody, who staged his Wild West show all over, the United States and Europe and United Kingdom, he really promoted the Pony Express, and he lied about his service in the Pony Express. He never, they did a census in 1860, and Buffalo Bill was 14 years old, and he's listed at school in Leavenworth, Kansas. So he wasn't part of it, but he really promoted it, and he knew something was going on. So in some way, it made it into the collective memory. But I have other theories. One, I think that the phrase Pony Express really rolls off the tongue nicely. And it's got a good inflection, and it sounds like exactly what it means. Horses Express. And I think that it's also fairly benign. I think that it was, there was all this manifest destiny going on, but this was just a mail service. And it sort of appeals to people in this romantic way of the lone rider carrying the mail. And I think that's really palatable history for us.
Interesting.
But nobody knows why we remember it so well.
Yeah. Questions from you all? Yeah, right up.
How much did it cost to send a letter?
It cost $5 in 1860, and so that's the equivalent of about $160 today. And that was for a half ounce. They wrote it on tissue-thin paper, and the clientele reflects that heavy cost. That it's bankers, politicians, wealthy merchants. It wasn't really used for personal correspondence so much, unless it was between pretty wealthy people.
I'm going to piggyback off that question real quick. Comparable to other ways to send mail at the time.
Sure.
I mean, was it about the same price? Why not send it out with a Wells Fargo wagon?
Yeah. So the ways, if you wanted to send a letter from New York City to San Francisco in 1860, your two options were steamship, which went down the coast to the Isthmus of Panama. Then they put the mail on burros, hauled it over the mountains, and another steamship up to San Francisco. And that was like 30 days in good weather. But the delays were frequent and not insignificant. And the other, which is often called the first transcontinental mail, was a Butterfield stage route, which went from Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Memphis, Tennessee, very far south, down through even what was then part of Mexico. This predates the Gadsden Purchase. And that was about 21 to 25 days. So the Pony Express advertised delivery time was 10 days. And so they only shaved off 2 weeks from that. And in the winter, the Pony Express was much, much longer than that. So really, it was like I think the human condition is we always want faster communication. This is just part of the deal. And it was trying to speed it up by 2 weeks. And the cost benefit of that is to be debated, but those are the other two ways, steamship or the Butterfield stagecoach.
Yep.
Will, could you talk a little bit about how you got started, knowing that you were going to be out under the stars every night on private property, and whom did you contact? How did you set a plan to know where you were going to be?
Yeah, so I knew that I could cover like 20 to 25 miles per day. And so on a yellow legal pad, I mapped this out with Google Maps, and like county tax assessor websites could tell me landowner information. So I basically laid this out for 4 days of travel in a row, 1 day of rest. And this came out to be about 100 days. And I was looking at this and I'm like, there's no way I can plan this all out. Like, I don't even know how long the first 100 miles are going to take me. So I basically scrapped that plan and thought that if I could just plan out the first 2 weeks, then I'd have that under my belt. We'd be a little hardened to the road. I'd have a better idea of how the horses were faring, how I was doing, how my gear was sorting out. And so it all changed. But basically, I looked at like county roads, small farms, started finding landowner information. And the biggest part was making sure that the horses were ready, that they were acquainted with our routine, our daily and nightly routine. I carried an electric fence to keep my horses contained at night, which was 3/8-inch piece of rope with aluminum wires braided into it and a solar powered charger. And so I basically just tried to get the horses physically conditioned to do it, get my gear dialed in, and then to plan out the next 10 days. And I figured, just like throw caution to the wind and like, let's just see what happens.
Back.
How did riding Genghis Khan's Pony Express route prepare you for this or inspire you for this?
I knew that I better have a bunch of Advil in my pocket. I knew that you can't let your body get in the way of your intention of the goal. And so that stuff I did in Mongolia was pretty hard. That was about the same sort of 25 miles, get a new horse. But that was done at speed, so we'd cover like 100 miles a day almost. So this was a lot different. But basically I knew that like I just had to have my kit organized and be able to look after myself.
Yeah, right there.
Hi, Jacob. Could you go into the relationship between Black homesteaders and white homesteaders? Did it change over time where, at first it's like, we just need people in this place of land, it doesn't matter what race you are, and then did it change over time or?
Yeah, and so that's a complicated question. It really depends on place. The Nicodemus folks I started with, when they show up, there are a lot of ranchers around. And if you've ever seen Oklahoma, you know that the relationship between ranchers and homesteaders in general wasn't great. And so the ranchers, like they would do with many white homesteaders, they would run their cattle through like Nicodemus property crops. They didn't want them there because it's less land to graze on. But the Nicodemus folks, they got them to stop this because one time they ran off their cattle and they took one of the cowboys hostage until they returned. They found the cattle and returned it, and that put an end to that. And so, like, you have this, bumpy this sort of bumpy relationship early on, and then in a lot of the places, it's actually a pretty good working relationship. I asked one of the descendants what they thought about the relationship. I think this is in Deerfield, and DeWitty as well, and asked them, like, well, did you get along with your neighbors? Is there any, like, you left the South to come to DeWitty? Was there any of that violence? And they said, we're in DeWitty homesteads. It's in the, like, closer to the Sand Hills. And so they were allowed to homestead more land, 640 acres. Like, you need help on your farm. None of us had time for that. We had to get along and help each other. In other places where, like in Blackdom, where they have more neighbors who migrated from white Southerners who migrated to Roswell, it's more contentious. There's one case of a murder while one of the homesteaders is in police custody in Empire, Wyoming. And it was like a tragic story. The guy is essentially committed by his family because they were concerned for his mental health. And then while in custody, he's murdered. And that community falls apart because of that, because his brother tries to get justice for him and just can't get justice. And then the community fractures and they break apart. But aside for Empire, the relationship is mostly congenial with white homesteaders. Now, when you get to town, there are some of these towns around them are sundown towns. So Black homesteaders have to be back to their homesteads by sundown. And they're not welcome in some of the schools. So there is this, they got away from the violent racism that permeated the South they came from, but the sort of that core of racism is still there. Oscar Michaud, who ends up becoming the first great Black filmmaker, homesteads in South Dakota, and he falls in love with a white woman, but he knows that won't fly, and has to give that up. And you see in his films there's a recurring theme. He plays with race of his characters. Often, like, a Black character will fall in love with a white character, only to find out in the third act that she actually had a Black grandmother, and so they can be married. So he's sort of playing with American notions of race in his films later, based on that experience on the plains.
I'll say that's one of the most interesting parts of the book, is how these migrants were received and how they navigated these waters. And in some cases, it's inspiring, because we're all out here on the plains together. You know, we all have to deal with this. You know, there's no timber. It's a long distance between towns. And I thought that was a pretty interesting part of the book, for sure.
Were there native tribes?
Yeah, and so we didn't come across much interaction with native tribes. Nicodemus was really poor off early on because they were lied about what was going to be there. So they didn't think they'd have to spend all their savings on just keeping themselves fed through that first winter, because they arrived too late to plant crops. They were in a bad way. And according to some descendants and some records with the town at the time, Osage Indians coming back from their hunt shared food with Nicodemus to help the town to stay fed through that first winter. So that was the only interaction we saw there. And a lot of these homesteaders show up, there isn't that interaction because the native tribes had been removed from their land before it was open for homesteading. That's a little bit different in South Dakota, where the government does a magic trick and opens up. They decide native people need to live more like white folks. So they put them on 160-acre plots. And so then there's land left over after they do that. And they declare it surplus land that they're going to open for white folks to homestead on. They have to pay, and the money will be kept in trust for the tribes. But it's, of course, embezzled and never goes there.
What do you know about the boys that rode the Pony Express?
We know that not very many of them were literate, and that they had no paper, and they kept no diaries almost. And most of what we know was told in retrospect, like journalists interviewing these guys later. But there are some firsthand accounts. They were all young guys that most of them were products of the land, more or less. They were pretty savvy guys. You know, they were certainly good horsemen, and they had a knowledge of the land and of sort of what it entailed to ride across it. But we don't know too much. And so many of their stories are just not true that they told. There's a long history in the West of like tall tales, and they sure they rode that horse to the bank, but a lot of it you almost have to infer, and there are some good accounts. There were guys who rode for the Pony Express who would later go on to work for Wells Fargo, and so we can get glimpses of it, but they didn't send any letters home and they didn't keep diaries.
Yeah, that was what I was surprised about, was how scant the documentary evidence is for the Pony Express, actually, which could contribute to why it's become such a...
So easy to mythologize.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There's so little evidence to prove contrary that, we don't know.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask, Will, you're on horseback for 100 miles or for 100 days. You've got this routine, you've got this mindset. How is it getting off the trail and coming back to wherever you come back to? Yeah.
I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico now. And so it took me 142 days in total. So that's 5 months. And I'll tell you, by the end of that, I had enough of that fun, But it really, once I got through Nevada, Nevada is sparsely populated, desert country, but beautiful and so quiet. And the sun rises and the sun sets. I mean, it's so quiet, I could hear insects crawling in the grass around me. And then I got to California, right south of Reno, Carson City, Nevada. And the population, the press of people was so discouraging. And the amount of traffic and how fast people were driving, that I was ready to be done. I was like, that is mission accomplished. We have done this, and I'm ready to shave and sleep in a bed. So, yeah.
Jacob, could you talk about Black land ownership subsequent to the migration? There's an organization called American Black Farmers. It's actually based here in Virginia that has documented, once the Soil Conservation Service and the loans and the discriminatory practices, the ownership rates had gone way down.
Way down is probably an understatement. Since 1930, the number of Black farmers in the United States has decreased by, I think, 95%, which I think the non-Black farmers, it's, I think, only 63%. And most of that's in the South. I think it's a decline more similar to non-Black farmers. If you go north and west, I think it's closer to 70%, still higher, but not that 95%. Yeah, and there's a Nicodemus descendant who, while his neighbors were getting USDA loans to keep their farms afloat, I think in the 80s, he couldn't get one and so had to sell the land. Yeah, it's Black farming has been, I think, under assault through the racist practices of federal government programs. And we deal with that a little bit in the epilogue.
Definitely.
You had a question.
Yeah, I just wonder, on the plains, how they built how they built their first home with
Yeah.
nothing to build it out.
Right. Yeah. So they built it out of sod. And you'll see we found an incredible amount of photos of Black homesteaders in the book. And so I'll start by saying, to a urban reader in the 21st century, you'll look at those photos and be like, oh, that's bleak. But then you have to get the 19th century mindset and okay, they're building their house out of sod. That's what folks did. And if there's a wooden house, they've got some money because they've had the money to buy the timber. And then in the background, you can see some horses photobombing. They put those there for a reason. They're showing off their wealth. Horses are expensive, and they allow you to travel and do work. They're necessary for your trip. Sometimes, and if you see a well or even a windmill, that is advanced technology. There's one photo we figured out. There's a windmill that's actually self-regulating. So once the tank fills, it stops by itself. It's like, I know, right? And now I've gone off and I've forgotten the original question. How'd they get started? So generally, folks started by building a dugout sod house because you need shelter. So you start by digging into the ground. So you're a little bit underground. So it makes the job of building walls a little bit easier. You have some ready-made walls. There's a plow that would cut sod without tilling it. And so then you'd cut the sod into bricks that are manageable to then stack. It's impossible to keep a sod house clean though. So like folks, your house is made of dirt. Like, you're not going to keep it clean. And there are stories, and then you'd have some plank, you'd find whatever wood you could to build part of the roof. There are stories of snakes falling from the ceiling, right? Because you're building a house out of the snake's home. One woman in her diary claimed she could hear in a particularly dry summer centipedes crawling in the walls. So yeah, you started with a sod house, and if you had enough money, you would pay for that wood, and the sod house would become something else, like a barn perhaps.
But it sounds like backbreaking labor.
Yeah, it was difficult. I didn't go the Will route. I didn't actually go out and build a sod house. Our process was different.
Boy, that would have been a good chapter.
I remember at one point I got upset that there was no cost-effective way to fly to Pierre, South Dakota, and I'd have to drive there and get on any horses. It was backbreaking labor. But necessary as part of that proving up process to get your free land. One unsuccessful homesteader, this is a white homesteader later on, I think as the Dust Bowl approached, he characterized the Homestead Act saying the federal government bets you 160 acres of land that you can't make it on the plains.
Did they try to establish schools early on?
Oh, absolutely. Like school and church were the first things that were established. And Nicodemus, Zachary Fletcher and his wife, Jenny, they established a school in the dugout. It's the priority. And you talk to descendants, so yeah, our grandparents were pretty clear that the community was founded for education. It was a way, they're farming to make their living, but they're there to educate the next generation. So we became who we are. And I buy that argument too, like, because again, sort of the undercurrent of racism that exists in the plains, there weren't eligible marriage partners for a lot of generations. A lot of these towns are only, like the largest is about 300 folks, and they're not really towns, right? They're communities. They're sort of rural neighborhoods, people on 160 and 640 acres of land.
Yep.
Yeah, so, I mean, what does success look like? I mean, how many families made the 5 years? Did they get, how much did they get lied to and cheated? And it just.
Yeah, I mean, the Nicodemus, when they get there, they're really angry about the lies they were told about what would be at the town site. And they try to attack the landowner, and they're going to kill the guy. And he has to hide under a load of hay in a friend's wagon and get out of town to Stockton until cooler heads prevailed. So there is a lot of that going on. And I think if I had another 10 years to research this book, I would like to get into some of the records for harvesting equipment, because you could get loans or payment plans to buy the harvesting equipment at the time. I would like to be able to try to figure out if Black owners are being charged the same price as white landowners, but we're not sure about that. At the end, and we're just looking at the Great Plains. So I know there are Black homesteaders that homestead further out in the Pacific Northwest and California. But in the Great Plains, we're looking at about 650,000 acres of land that was homesteaded, which is, I think, about the size of Rhode Island. And about 3,500 claimants with family members. That's probably close to 20,000 Black folks who left the South and went west to homestead, which is small. I think in the Great Plains, there are about 1 million successful homesteads in total. So it's a percentage of that, but an important story, because I think it changes the story of who settled the Great Plains. I talked to one descendant, because Nicodemus every year in the summer, they have a homecoming / Emancipation Day, and there's a parade and food. I was talking to a descendant there, and he says, I think he was from Philadelphia, and he said every time he tells his friends he's going back to Nicodemus, Kansas, his friends are like, there aren't any Black people in Kansas. No, I assure you, there are. So it's a smaller number, but I think it's an important part of the story. And I think it's also the prelude to the Great Migration, right? In the 19th and early 20th century, the actions on the land, it's a rural society, free land is a way to make it. And as you get later in the 20th century, particularly with the Dust Bowl, the actions in the cities, and there's a whole new industry of, you can go to a movie in a city where recreation becomes much more important to American society in the 20th century, and that's happening in cities as well. So the actions in the cities for that traditional Great Migration we think of.
So you speak to the descendants. How was the story passed down? Is it word of mouth, or was it diaries?
Yeah, there aren't many diaries that we've found. So it's, mostly word of mouth. And Joyce Ann Gray, one of the descendants of DeWitty, you could find her website. She's written novels about DeWitty. I mean, she wants to share the story of DeWitty with everyone. And she was one of our closest relationships with descendants. And there are some folks still on the land. Most have sort of, the next generations, they moved off and they did other things, became doctors and not farmers. There are some folks up in Sully County, South Dakota, who are still hold on to the land that was homesteaded. And Dave, have I answered the question? I keep losing, I keep losing track of the question in the middle of me.
You had a question earlier.
Yeah, with so much data and so much material and so much personal experience, how do y'all prioritize what's most important for the story? How do you structure it? Like, what are the first steps that you take when it's your material, but it's not your material, and it's got history behind it? Where do you find the balance with that?
So you're asking about process, like how to,
The actual act of starting to write it.
Yeah, and with a co-author too. So we're like writing. We break up chapters. Like, well, we know we want to write because there are chapters about six different homesteading communities. And then we have Black homesteaders who homesteaded away from other Black folks. And we know we want these chapters about communities. So we sort of broke up and just started writing chapters, and then tearing them down, building them back up, making sure our writing styles then went together. And then it was clear to us that those folks starting out from Nicodemus, that's sort of the starting point of the Black homesteader story. So the starting point was actually easy for us because Nicodemus was the oldest, longest lived, and sort of still there as a place today. Then after that, it was like we shuffled these chapters around, I think 10 times before we were like, okay, I think the pacing is right. Though I did read one Goodreads review of the book that said, well, I couldn't make it past like the 4th chapter on, but it's good. It's good history. But
I'm serious. I found the book super readable. I think it's super engaging, and I saw that review too, and I think that's I don't know what's going on there.
Trying to forget it.
Yeah. Will, you want to talk about that?
I would say a good editor. My editor was critical to the process. And so we basically, I just laid it all out there, even in brief terms, on kind of an outline form. And then for my personal experience stuff, like who I met, what I saw, what I learned, and my editor would ask, to what end does this serve? What is the value of telling me that this guy has, the chickens, or that the dairy farm is struggling, or this kind of stuff. And so we would sort through the material to try to figure out what really is moving everything forward. And then with the historical stuff, we wanted to make sure that what we presented was checkable, was we were able to fact check this information to make sure that it was correct and that it was important and that it was interesting. But the editor, for me, I didn't have a co-author, and my editor was highly involved in the process and very responsive. And
is there any content you cut that you were like thinking?
I
wish that story was in there.
Oh yeah, I wish the book was twice as long. Yeah,
That's exactly my question.
Yeah. Cutting it. I mean, they call it killing your darlings in journalism. You got to get rid of this stuff, even if it's cool. You can bring it up at a cocktail party, but the book is not the place for it. Maybe.
Yep.
Yeah. Another question about process for Will. I assume you started this hoping that there was a book at the end of it. And so how did that affect the journey? I mean, were you always stopping to take notes? Did you have a tape recorder? Did you do most of your research about the Pony Express before you went?
So the way this worked is that I wrote an article for Outside Magazine in 2017 about a small section of the Pony Express Trail that I did. And then we converted that into a book proposal, which then was the foundation for the book. but I did a lot of research afterward as well. And as far as taking notes, I kept in the breast pocket of my vest, I kept a little spiral bound notebook that I would write down people's names and phone numbers or any kind of contact information. And then in my saddlebags, I carried a larger notebook where I would sit down and write every night. But day to day, or like during the day, I recorded a lot of videos in my cell phone of me dictating who I'd met, what they were wearing, what they told me, direct quotes, this kind of stuff, so that I could assemble that. And then every chance I got, I'd tear out the pages of my notebook, I'd photograph them with my phone, and then I'd tear them out and send them home so that there was no chance of losing that material.
Did you have a solar charger for your phone?
No, I get asked a lot, like, what'd you do about phone battery usage? Because my phone was critical to navigation, satellite images. Like, even looking at a farm or a ranch to stay, I would look at the satellite image. And if I could see like 15 junked cars in front of the house, I'd be like, maybe not where I want to stay tonight, you know? And so my phone, I wasn't like surfing Instagram. I wasn't like cruising the web on my phone. I was very frugal with my use of the phone, and I carried a battery pack that I could charge it, and I charged it at every chance I got, like in barns and farmyards and stuff, and then would even have to pull up to like a roadside stop, like a gas station, and plug in my phone to an outlet, and then just like sit there with my hat over my eyes, trying to keep a low profile, but it was difficult.
I've got a question about process as well that I sort of teed you up for on our walk over here. I'm trying to imagine how I would pitch to my wife that I'm going to spend 100 days riding the Pony Express. How'd that conversation?
I wish she was here. She could answer it. She's a physician assistant in the emergency room in Santa Fe. But she is always supportive of these things I want to do with horses, and she's like, well, if they're going to pay you what they say you're going to pay you, I guess you can do it, and I was like, it's only going to be 100 days. It's not too long. I'll be back for, the end of August. And that didn't play out, but she's like, what are you going to do? When we got together, she knew this is part of the deal. Like, I'm not looking for a desk job, even though writing is a desk job. I got to like get some dirt under my fingernails, so.
And she pops up occasionally throughout the trip.
She does. Yeah. She got me started in Missouri, through Kansas, just to make sure the horses were good and I was good. And then she met me for 4th of July, brought up like, cooked dinners and stuff. And then she met me in California. So she does come up. She was part of the process. She's, it would have been very difficult to do it without her support and encouragement.
Yep, back there.
What are your next projects?
I just started a new position as the director of the Center for Lincoln Studies in the University of Illinois Springfield, and my life has become sort of a fun administrative quagmire. So I'm trying to find that time after I get the center sort of where I want it to be. I'm going to carve out some of that time to actually sit, think, and write. So I'm not sure what the next project is yet. Probably something to do with Abraham Lincoln, though.
I am also as well sorting this out, but I have an idea that I could retrace part of the old Silk Road in Central Asia, because this is where they domesticated horses, and the relationship between horses and humans runs deeper in this part of the world than anywhere else. So my plan is to travel with a Marco Polo type caravan expedition from the Aral Sea in western Uzbekistan to the mountains of western China.
Yep.
This question is for Will. What kind of food did you eat on the trail? Did you take to authentic beans?
So cans of beans wouldn't really be so authentic for these guys. I mean, what they were eating back then, they were like eating wolf mutton. They were near to starving to death a lot of times. And just trying to get, flour and baking soda to bake some kind of bread. So we didn't want to do that. because I needed the calories to make sure I could get through the day. But my diet basically didn't vary. I would carry like 8 to 10 days worth of food, and like Dinny Moore beef stew. Have you ever heard of this in a can? I mean, I lived off that stuff. Macaroni and cheese, a can of chili with Fritos for Frito pie, a few dehydrated backpacker meals. It was pretty rough, but it wasn't a culinary exercise.
This is for Will. It might be a bit too personal, but you mentioned the strip, horses, all that. How is that funded?
It was funded. So I'll tell you what, it was the cheapest summer of my life. I never went out. I'd never spent any money except for on my groceries, and the horses had to get new shoes. And I laid out, like about $13,000 in horse flesh and buying these 2 horses before I started. But it was funded by the advance from my publisher.
We have time for maybe one more question, then we'll give you an opportunity to meet the authors personally in the back. Yep. Yeah.
I mean, what's the moment of magic for both of you that surprised you in doing this? Like for Will, I'm imagining, oh my God, it's under the stars, and I saw this and thought humanity needs to see this. What's the one thing that touched you that's your message to all of us in writing your books?
I think, talking with descendants, I think that was powerful because you could see that the story. It wasn't just an exercise in uncovering this history that needs to be written. It means something that's personal to other folks. And I think I have these moments every once in a while. One descendant, when I was done talking with them, handed me a nail from one of the homesteaders' homes, and she's like, "Gee, I just want you to have this." And it's like those connections are, powerful.
And I would say mine was a connection too. It basically, like what you're saying, sitting there leaning against my saddle on my bedroll underneath the stars and contemplating this transcontinental horse-borne mail service was for me, like, it provided a real direct connection to the history that I probably should have anticipated, but it became a lot more real when I was out there in the desert. And I met one guy in particular in central Nevada who I write about, who really occurred to me as the last man standing of the Pony Express. And he provided a direct connection to the history in a lot of different ways, in the way he looked and the way he spoke. And
that is a great concluding question, I think, for our 2 authors. Please join me in thanking them.